the second session of our capacity building workshop on outcomes-based contracting. For those of you that don't know me, I am Shamsia Ali. I'm part of the small HBGI team, one of the senior advisors here, and I lead on fundraising and business development. And it's really great to have you all here. As I said, this is the second instalment of our capacity building workshop on outcomes-based contracting. We're delivering a number of these remotely, virtually, online over this calendar year, and each one, as most of you will probably now know, is free to attend. We did hold our first one back in May, and that was an introduction to outcomes-based contracting. This session is building on that and is focusing on how you build effective performance management on these outcomes-based contracts so that we can deliver greater results for the individual service user. There'll be some overarching principles shared by Richard in his presentation and by colleagues at Social Finance, and then all of that is peppered with some really useful and interesting real-life programme examples. As a way of background, again, most of you will be aware of this. About this time last year, we launched a call for expression of interest to engage with the service providers working in the mental health sphere to identify programmes that are being delivered that could be amenable to outcomes funding or to being contracted on outcomes. We subsequently produced a report that summarises and showcases the programmes that we received, and some really interesting programmes there featured. And these capacity building workshops come as a sort of off the back of that. If you haven't read the report, we will put a link on the chat a little bit later. But please do peruse it. There's some great programmes featured and some great organisations. Some of them are here on the call, and you'll hear from one a little bit later. I'm not going to do an introduction to HBGI in the interest of time, but again, the report has a good overview of us, and I can also share a 2-page overview in the chat that gives you a sense of how we operate, but you will get a sense of that through Richard's presentation. I've referred to Richard a fair bit. I'm going to introduce you to Richard. Richard's our CEO. He will be leading most of this session. Richard has over 20 years of experience of working in the field of social inclusion or exclusion, however it is termed, including health and employment, and mental health has been a running theme in the last couple of decades and plus some, as has outcome-based contracting or results-based financing. And I think Richard, along with some of our other colleagues on this call, are one of the world experts on this approach to funding or contracting programmes. Richard, I'll leave it to you to do a much more detailed introduction when you start speaking, and do yourself justice. I'm sorry if I'm repeating, as I wasn't able to hear at the start, but I also wanted to take the opportunity to introduce you to Roxanne, who's joined us on a 6-month fellowship from McKinsey, and Roxanne is doing some amazing work helping up with our global strategy and projects. We're also joined by some of our members of our Lived Experience Council, and our Lived Experience Council are really integral to everything we do. They ensure that we've got the lived experience voice of people with lived experience of mental health, that we have that voice and angle considered in everything we do in terms of our strategy and operation. There is also a really good report that we've produced that talks about how we work with our Lived Experience Council, and some recommendations, suggestions to other organisations that wish to embed lived experience within their organisation. I'll share the link to that as well. I'm having a quick look to see who's on the call. So maybe Charlene, if you're able to turn your camera on and just say hello. Charlene's part of our Lived Experience Council. We're also joined by Kimberly. Kimberly was a member of our Lived Experience Council, and now we really have the pleasure of having her on our board of directors. If I've missed anyone else from the LEC that's on the call, my apologies, but please do say hello. That just leaves me to introduce our guest of honour for this session. We are really delighted to have Social Finance join us today. Social Finance are featured in the report I mentioned, the Paying for Outcomes and Mental Health report mental health program report. And in fact, one of the programs that they will talk about today is featured in that report. They will provide the service provider perspective and give a really good flavour of how they've performance managed on a couple of the programs that they've been involved in. Two great examples, and I'll leave social finance to introduce you to those programs. So we are joined by Jane Newman, who's the International Director at Social Finance, as well as Sarah Bailey, who's one of the managers leading on the employment and skills practices, and then Chloe Edelston, who's also a manager at Social Finance and is working on a number of development impact bonds, and is a manager at the international team. Again, similarly to Richard, colleagues, please do a good introduction to yourselves when you're presenting. Just some final or some real high level of housekeeping before I hand over to Richard. So this is the second of this session. We had the first one this morning. It is a repeat. We are recording the session, so we will make the recording and the slide decks from today's session available. And I've just realised that I haven't got my camera on, so apologies. The lack of audio at the beginning threw me slightly. So we will record and share the recording and the slide decks with you towards the end of the week. We'll put it up on our website and we'll email it to you. For that reason, can I just ask everyone to go on mute? It just makes it clearer for us to hear and the recording, but we do want to hear from you. So if you've got any questions or comments, please do raise the virtual hand, or preferably during the session, please jot them on the chat, and I'll monitor those, and then we'll have plenty of sessions for comments and questions, as we do want to hear from you. Otherwise, I think that's it. Over to you, Richard.
Thank you, Shamsia, and welcome everybody. I hope we have got an interesting couple of hours for you here. If you know me from before, just to make it clear, I'm not an academic, I'm not a researcher. I'm going to present to you a very personal view on the basis really of the last 23 years of working on outcomes contracts. For 12 years, I set up and I ran private sector for-profit organizations delivering in the UK, Australia, France, and Germany, with contracts with governments paid on the basis of the outcomes we delivered, and those outcomes principally being jobs for people who had been long-term unemployed, out of work for years and years. And I worked on across a number of organizations in that time, and we'll talk about a couple of those here. Then I had 10 years or so working as a senior consultant for the World Bank and a senior advisor at the Global Fund, again looking at how contracting could be used as a tool to increase the performance of programs, and performance management specifically as a tool. And for the last 18 months with HPGI, where again, we're looking to use outcomes contracting as a way to attract additional funding to enable us, hopefully, to contract at scale new services addressing poor mental health and its causes and consequences. Could I have the next slide, please? So it's a very personal view here. And the one after that? That one. I want to talk just a little bit about what performance is and what performance isn't. It might seem obvious, but I found that it often isn't. We'll look at performance management within some programs, and I've got some basic principles for you that I've pulled out of my experience and some examples to talk you through. I'll talk about how I tried to embed performance management in the design of a whole organization, and then also how we applied performance management across a system of service providers. The next slide, please. And again, so when the Taliban first left Afghanistan in 2000, all of the health services, the basic and essential health services in that country, there weren't any. So they contracted them out when the international community went in. They contracted them initially to international NGOs and then to local NGOs. And those contracts continued. They were basically a budget reimbursement model that they used. So they agreed a service specification with the service providers, and then they reimbursed the costs to those providers. And the performance wasn't bad, but it reached a bit of a plateau. And there was some waste, if not potential fraud within the system. And it was a very rigid, process-oriented delivery. And the Minister of Public Health decided that he wanted to shift from contract management to performance management. I'm not sure where he'd got this phrase, a visionary guy, Dr. Farouz, but this was what he decided to push through the system. And I joined a World Bank team as a consultant to help them decide exactly what that meant and how to implement it. And it started off with me reviewing existing services in the country. And I went to Kabul and spoke to about 50 different stakeholders within the ministry, elsewhere in the government, across the ministry in different departments, within the World Bank, within the aid agencies that were funding these programs. And the basic question that I asked all of these different 50 people was, what is performance? What do you understand success to look like on these contracts? And I received 50 different answers. Seriously, there was not a single answer the same as another. For everybody, performance was something different, generally driven by their own agenda, by their own perception of what they wanted, I suppose, from these contracts. It was very heavy on the administration, very heavy on process and on paperwork, and there was no single coherent view. I'll come back to that in a minute. Next slide, please. Another story for you, and this is going back further. This is 2003. And the organization that I was leading had won a number of contracts to deliver outcome-based services to long-term unemployed people in 2 parts of London. And we'd opened these offices in central London and West London. One of the offices was in a place called Hammersmith. And I received a call one morning from the manager of the office in Hammersmith who said, Richard, we've got a problem. Our contract manager is here from the department and there's an issue. We need you to come as quickly as you can. So I jumped on the tube, rushed to Hammersmith to meet with this person from the department. So this was an employment services office. That meant that we had about 30 case managers working in this office, each of them with a caseload of long-term unemployed people that they would meet to help them on the journey back to a job and to sustain that employment. And during the course of a day, these 30 people might see between them about 200 job seekers coming through the door. And in order to encourage these job seekers to come to see us, to get them active, to activate them and get them busy and into our office so we could have a conversation with them about employment, we said we would reimburse their bus tickets. Anyone who comes to see us, bring your bus ticket and we'll give you the money back for that ticket. It was £1 or £2. Wasn't a lot of money, but there were hundreds and hundreds of them. And I knew that in many cases, they picked a bus ticket off the ground outside and brought that in to get their £2. But that was fine. They came to see us. That was the objective. Contract manager from the department said, I believe you are reimbursing their bus tickets. I need to see all of those bus tickets, please. In order for us to audit this, I need to see every ticket that you have reimbursed. By this point, there have been thousands. And we had a contract to engage with people and to get them into jobs. Our contract said nothing about bus ticket reimbursement. It had no relevance to the service being delivered. I showed the contract manager the door. Caused some issues, but we weren't going to be audited on that basis. Some years later, a couple of years ago, providing advice to the Global Fund, we reviewed a training program in Sierra Leone, funded by the Global Fund, in which they were pretty much doing exactly the same. They were, the Global Fund, tracking their expenditure, tracking whether or not the money was spent by asking for receipts from the program in Sierra Leone. And there were hundreds of these receipts for room hire, for buses, for food, for per diems paid to people to attend. There was nothing to say that they were the right people attending, that that was the actual cost of the room, that they actually ate the meals that there was a receipt for, but there were pieces of paper that they were auditing. I don't think that was performance. Next slide, please. Oh, too many times I have come across this notion of a recruitment freeze or a hiring freeze. I don't know if you've heard the phrase, but often when an organization gets into trouble, and that might be a private sector organization or indeed a public sector organization, when they get into trouble, they feel that their performance is struggling, they impose a hiring freeze, We will not hire any more staff, they say, because we've got to control our bottom line. Our performance is the bottom line of money. So they stop recruitment. Of course, they lose staff because people resign, people move on, the numbers of staff dwindle, but they don't replace them. And as their staff number gets smaller and smaller, their ability to deliver services, to deliver performance gets harder and harder, and they find themselves in a vicious cycle. Of course, we have to operate in a commercial environment. We've got to recognize that it costs money to deliver things. But if we're aiming to deliver performance, we cannot simply focus on that bottom line. It will simply tie our hands and distract us from the outcomes that we're looking to achieve. Next slide, please. In 2 weeks, I'm going to go and start with HBGI a review in California of something called full service partnerships. They're effectively intensive case management for homeless people. Roughly 170,000 in California, though that's an estimate, and about 60,000 of them eligible for these full service partnerships, which are intended to assist people living on the street with chronic mental health conditions. And these services are not delivering for these people. They're not delivering. Well, I haven't had the conversation yet, but the first question I'm going to ask when I arrive in California of the people paying for these services, of the state, of the counties, of the people delivering the services, of the people in receipt of the services is, what is performance here? What does success look like? Because right now they're not achieving outcomes for those individuals. They're not moving them from the streets into accommodation, back to families, into employment, into some sort of sustainable livelihood. We'll see. Next slide, please. We talked about this in the last session that we had around outcomes contracting and how our focus generally when we talk about performance, we're looking to try and define something in terms of outcomes, the outcomes for the people accessing the program. Can I have the next slide, please? So what is performance? What is success? Can we agree on a single coherent definition of what success looks like, what good looks like? Are we all talking about the same things? And are we actually counting and talking about something that matters for the individual on that program? Or are we talking about something that is a complete distraction from it? Unless we can answer these questions, we can't design a contract. We surely can't deliver a program that is meaningful, and we can't performance manage it. Let's move on, Roxanne, please. So some basic principles of performance management. Yes, carry on. A somewhat crude definition here of performance management, but I think it indicates some of the basic drivers here. This is what's called a Skinner's box. Skinner was a psychologist back in the mid part of the last century, early part of the last century, who developed this system in which the rat would learn to press the lever when the light came on and be rewarded by receiving some food. And because the food came following the pressing of the lever when the light came on, the rat learnt the association between these things. It was conditioned to press the lever when that light was on. Skinner also did it in the opposite way with pain, to decondition certain behaviors. So the floor of this box was actually electrified. This experiment has been repeated far too many times since then, but a basic principle remains, and excuse the very simplistic illustration of it, but we need to identify the activities that are important and to reinforce them with reward, with feedback, with something that is saying this is good or this is bad. The next slide, please. And in very simple terms, I essentially think this is what performance management is. And when I look at programs, when I review programs and have done so over the last 20 or so years, and they're not managing their performance, whether it's an outcomes contract or not, they're generally not doing this. So I will visit the program and ask them, how many people do you have on your program right now? How many are on your books? And they can't tell me. How many came last week? Don't know. What did you do with the people that came last week? They don't know. They're not tracking what is happening within that program and recording it. There's no case management system, and you probably need a case management system of some sort, whatever the program is. They're not recording what's happening. There's no reporting of it. So there's no accountability. And there's no review then of those numbers, of that activity, in order to understand what's working and what isn't working so that we can revise it. And generally, in all of the programs that I now oversee, and I've been chairing social impact bonds for a decade or so, currently chair 3 of them, one in the UK, one in Palestine, and one just starting in South Africa. At the core of it is a performance board that meets on a monthly basis, and we review the tracking, the recording, and the reporting of what has happened in that month. We look at what's worked and what hasn't worked, and we suggest revisions. What's going to be different next month to make this better? And as HBGI roll out contracts and roll out performance management, this is essentially the system that we'll be talking about. Next slide, please. It's on this, we're focusing on our outcomes. We want to deliver as many outcomes as possible for our service users. But in order to ensure that we get there, we also need to be following the inputs and the outputs. Just click on next, Roxanne, please. So we need to know how many people are being enrolled on the training, how many turn up for it, how many complete it, how many get their qualifications, in order to determine or not whether we actually get the behavior changes that we're looking for in the clinic. And then alongside that, we can do an impact evaluation to understand the wider impact of this service delivery. For our performance management, we want to look across that piece, and performance management in terms of driving what's going to happen tomorrow and in the next month is all about the first 3. Next slide, please. So we need a clear understanding of what performance is. We all need to have that same understanding, and we need to stick to it and keep consistent with it. We need to be absolutely transparent over this. I need to track and report on your performance and show that performance to everybody. If you try and do this in the dark, that's when things go wrong. When things go right, we really need to celebrate this. It's a basic principle. Let's really cheer on the people within the service. Let's really cheer on when things are working. When things are not working, we have to be willing to change and to flex. This is one of the strengths, actually, of an outcomes contract, in that you're not tied to a rigid service specification. You're tied to achievement of an outcome for each individual on your program, and you flex and adapt that as you go along. And of course, this happens within some sort of financial context. And there is a relationship between the money that we put in and the performance that we get out. When we do grant-based funding, when we give grants to programs, when we pay for public sector services, far too often that relationship is simply forgotten or broken. But there is a direct causal link between how many case managers I have and how many outcomes they're going to be achieved. How many trainings I deliver, good quality trainings to the right people, and how much behavior change I can deliver. How many of the children receive decent care immediately post-birth, as we'll see in the example with social finance later, and how many of those children are going to live. Next slide, please. Some examples for you, starting off with some examples of specific programs, and we'll go back to Afghanistan quickly. Basic and essential health services, we shifted these programs from reimbursing their budgets to paying them for specific services being delivered. And this was performance managed by the Ministry of Public Health with assistance from the World Bank and some capacity building from an organization in the UK. Next slide, please. So I managed to agree with all of the 50 stakeholders and beyond that performance on these programs actually meant more people receiving more better healthcare. No one could argue with that. But I then turned to the experts, the health experts, and said, so what does a better health service look like? What actual interventions is it delivering? Can you give me a manageable number? I'm really looking for 7. We compromised on 11. But if we've got more of these things going on, we know we've got a better health service. If you like, they're the thermometer for healthcare in the country. And they came up with these. That's antenatal care, postnatal care, institutional deliveries of babies, and so on. I won't go through all of them, but they're the 11 key interventions the experts came up with. And we came up with a nominal fee for each one of those. So each time the service provider delivers one of those, effectively, they can submit a claim to be paid for it. Actually, they submitted a claim every 3 months, but you get the idea. Next slide, please. We varied the prices across the regions because each region was very different. Some of them were big and urban, some of them were very rural and remote, and the difficulty of delivering meant different costs for the service providers. So the costs across those 11 indicators, those 11 interventions, varied from area to area. Next slide, please. We'll just jump quickly through the next couple of slides, but once we introduce these contracts, the performance of these programs significantly increased across all except a couple of measures where there was huge confusion between different aid organizations all trying to do the same thing. But across most of them, the change in terms of that performance, 2018 to 2019, this is when the new contracts came in, those are the purple lines, the performance shoots up. Next one, please. And interestingly, performance shot up also on health interventions that weren't being paid for, because in delivering those 11, these health services improved all of their care. So they improved across the piece. And again, Roxanne, we'll jump over the next one, please. Let's go on to the next slide. And this was the key dashboard for me. I think this is very exciting. Perhaps I'm a bit nerdy about this, but this simply did not exist in Afghanistan until we changed these contracts and introduced performance management. Down the left-hand side, you've got all of the 33 regions where the services are being delivered. In 31 of them, they've got these new contracts. Along the top, you've got the key interventions. And then it's color-coded according to whether the organization is hitting or exceeding their target, is hitting a baseline performance measure, or is falling below that baseline. The light blue in the top, they're exceeding their targets. The dark purple, they're missing even the baseline. So you can see the top 5, the top 10 organizations, the top 10 regions are performing really quite well. They're exceeding lots of their targets. Down at the bottom, they're not doing so well at all. This dashboard is now made public. All the service providers can see it. Everyone in the ministry can see it. They know who's performing well. They know who's not performing so well. They can do something about this. They can recontract and give more contracts to the high performers. They could terminate the contracts of those who are not performing, or at least intervene and try and improve it. They've got a tool now which tells them who is performing in comparison with others to drive that performance. Next slide, please. Another example, this is a social impact bond and outcomes contract in the UK. This is around 2006, maybe 7 or 8. In the north of England, the target is young people who are struggling in school. The programme took them and put them over a 10-week period for half a day a week into a nursery and paired them with a toddler, a 2-year-old, who was also having behavioural problems. In working with that toddler, the teenager started to and was encouraged to consider their own behaviour and their own attitudes, and to go back into school and improve the way they behaved in the classroom and their attainment. This one was actually performance managed by social finance, who we'll hear from later. Next slide, please. So on a monthly basis, I'm chairing the performance board of this. On a monthly basis, we come together. Social finance have worked with the service provider to produce this pack of data, of information. The service provider comes and presents it to us, and we review it. What's been happening? What was delivered last month? What worked? What didn't work? What do you need to do differently next month? Generally, the first page on all of these is your key milestones. Where are you? What's gone well and what has not gone so well. Next slide, please. You'll get these to take away and look at, and I'm not going through all of it. I realize it's a complicated slide, but this is really looking at the inputs and the outputs, not the outcomes. So we've got 5 cohorts. You can see them across the top, cohorts 1 to 5. That's 5 groups of young people who were enrolled at any one time and then put through the program as a group. And we're interested in whether they start. How many of the young people start? Do we have schools lined up, first of all? Do the young people start? Do we have the facilitators in place for this? And then once they're on the program, do they continue with us or do they drop out? How many of them stay for the first week? How many of them drop out after 9 sessions? What does this attendance look like? Are we getting good engagement from them? And what are the issues driving this? Next slide. Then, of course, we look at the outcomes. How is that translating into the outcomes that we're looking for? And those outcomes are also considered in financial terms, though we took the pounds off the bottom of this slide just to protect commercial confidentiality, if that's relevant in this context now. But you've got us looking at how many of them are achieving the outcome, what percentage conversion is that of the people starting on the program, and how does it map across all of our different outcomes being targeted. Next slide, please. Third example of a specific contract, a specific program for you. This is from, about 3 years ago. Single homeless prevention service trying to stop single people either becoming homeless because they're losing their accommodation, or once having lost that accommodation, ending up on the street. So can we move them back into accommodation as quickly as possible? Another outcomes contract, and this time performance managed by Bridges Outcomes Partnerships. I'm again chairing the board, and Bridges BOP is coming on a monthly basis to report on performance across a number of different service providers in 6 parts of London. The next slide, please. And we're looking at their performance in terms of how many people have been referred to the program and have started, how many people have had a PHP completed, that's an action plan of some sort, a housing plan, how many people have actually secured housing, and how many people have sustained that housing for a period of time, for 6 months. And in each area, in the last month, how did you do? How many of these did you achieve? And what was that against the target for the month that was set for you? Not a bad view, at least we're counting it, but it's a very monochrome view. It's very black and white. What happened last month could be distorted because of the time of the year, because there was a whole bunch of referrals 3 months ago. So their caseload has suddenly changed. In-month picture is quite limited. Next slide, please. So rather than just in-month, we can look at this cumulatively. How many have they actually achieved since the contract started in each of these 6 areas across those measures? And next slide, please. Still a little bit limited cumulatively. So can we get underneath this performance and try and understand the trend within that performance? This is the real trick in performance management, is understanding the trend, the flow of performance through the program, not just like this, but a flow of it. And here we came up with a way of trying to measure it on a 3-month basis. So the people that you accommodated this month, what does that look like as a conversion rate of the average of people referred to you over the previous 3 months? So I'll try and take some of the noise out across those months to give us an average number of referrals. What does your performance look like in relation to that? Next slide, please. I still want to get under the skin a little bit further. And again, so one back, please. So I still want to know what I always think that as performance managers and as contractors, actually our responsibility is to the people accessing the service. I need the service provider to be healthy, to be motivated, to be delivering well, but only really because my interests lie with that service user and as many as outcomes as possible for them. So I always want to know, is anybody missing out here? Is anyone falling through the gaps? Here we've got an analysis that tells me how long is it since each of the people has been seen? So the purple chunk, the purple piece of the pie in each of these is the number of people who were seen in the last week. We can see that Islington saw a lot of people in the last week. Ealing saw about half of their people in the last week, half of the young people who are potentially going to become homeless. And Brent saw the smallest number in the last week. Indeed, in Brent, we've got a problem because I've got a big dark blue segment. That big dark blue is 4 weeks or more. So 36 or 13% of the people on their caseload have not been seen for over a month. Why not? Where are they? In Islington, that's only 5%. Look across these 3, understand a little bit about the quality of what's going on behind the numbers in the previous slides. And which of these do you think would be performing highest? Brent, Islington, or Ealing? on the basis of this. It's actually Islington, of course. They're outperforming the other two quite significantly because their level of interaction, engagement with people is much higher. Let's push on, please. So in 2002, I had the extreme fortune to be given the opportunity to build a new organization pretty much from scratch. Our owners were in Australia, but they were entering the UK market for the first time. And this organization's objective was to move as many long-term unemployed people into jobs as possible. Clear definition of success or performance. If that is the purpose of the organization, then what does the organization itself look like? What sort of people do we employ to do this? What sort of premises do we put them in? How do we manage them? Let's design all of that with the single purpose of as many long-term unemployed people as possible into jobs. Quickly take you through what that meant in practice. Next slide, please. You may well have seen this before, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. What motivates us? The first thing we need to satisfy are some basic physiological needs, our hunger. In work terms, that might be a reasonable basic salary. And then it moves up until we reach the higher levels of motivation where achievement of some sort of intrinsic goal, something that's important to us, will be motivating us. How do you build an organization? How do you manage a team to achieve all of that? Next slide, please. So we decided first off to pay good salaries. We paid £5,000 a year more than our competitors did. If we want to move as many long-term unemployed people into work as possible, we've got to have exceptional case managers. Let's employ exceptional people. Let's deliver high performance and recognize that we have to invest in that. Let's put them into a working environment which makes them feel good and the people that they're trying to help feel good. Let's try and encourage them to make decisions. Let's give them autonomy. So let's think about the way we set out the environment and get rid of the desks that normally sit between case managers or the public sector and service users. Get rid of the desks. Let's get people sitting next to each other, looking at the screen together. So they're both in control of this relationship, of this environment, and of the outcome. Let's get rid of hierarchy within the organization so they feel this autonomy. These are going to be clever people. We're going to have to feed their intellects. And we're going to have to talk constantly about the language of performance. The organization is here to help as many long-term unemployed people as possible into employment. It became a mantra. It was said over and over again every day. And we had a rigorous recruitment process to ensure the people coming in to work in these jobs had a strong fit with the culture of performance. Next slide, please. Language was all we talked about. Everybody had a clear target. One job per, each case manager had to achieve one person into work per week. They had to get 3 sustaining that employment each month. 1 into work per week, 3 sustaining each month. They had it written on their foreheads. That's all they talked about. Have you got your 1 this week? Have you got your 3 this month? We put it up on whiteboards in the office so everybody could see how the office was tracking. Every week, I received a report from every single one of those officers. We had a review on a monthly basis by office, by contract, by organization. And we thought about what tools we needed to give these people. We didn't simply say, can everybody please work harder? That's never enough. That doesn't motivate people. If you want them to deliver higher performance, what tools are you giving them to achieve that in terms of the environment, in terms of the training, in terms of an IT system? Give them the conditions within which performance is possible. Then you can strongly, rigorously manage the individuals within that environment. So everyone working there knew if they weren't achieving their 1 a week, their 3 a month, then they would have a review with their manager. That review would become weekly, then daily. They would shadow other people who were performing. They would receive additional training. They would have an intensive program of performance improvement. And if it didn't work, after 3 months, they would exit the organization. In 4 years, no one actually exited after 3 months. People resigned before the end of the 3 months, and not one of them with any sense of resentment. They understood what was required of them. And if they left before that time, they said, fair enough, I knew what was needed, I had the tools, and it wasn't for me. Next slide, please. I've talked a little bit about this, not just point in time reporting, but trying to get this flow of performance through the program, which generally means following people by cohort. Everyone who started on the program in September 2022, where are they today? What's their journey been? Next slide, please. And we put respect in the middle of this service, in the middle of this performance. I only think you can achieve performance, particularly in the sort of programs that we're talking about with vulnerable individuals, if you start and finish with respect for those people. A long-term unemployed person can come to you with a whole bunch of complex challenges. They can have lived on the street for years. They can smell. They can be drunk. They can be aggressive. They can be depressed. But you have still got to look at them as someone with potential. They will see themselves reflected in your eyes. And unless you see that individual's potential, you're never going to achieve an outcome for them. Let's keep going, please. I think this is an important point, so I would just quite like to talk you through it. The number of people that you get into work on a program like this is directly related to the size of the caseload that you have. So you have a case manager working with unemployed people. If they're working with a small caseload, a small number of those people, they get a high percentage of them into jobs. If they're working with a big caseload, they get a smaller percentage into jobs. They can spend less time with them. Their interaction with them is less intensive. It's a direct correlation. This is an analysis that was done by an organization called Cambridge Policy Consultants in 2001. So all we have to do is give them smaller caseloads, yes? It's not quite that simple. Next slide, please. Ex-British civil servant from 100 or so years ago, I'm not sure when he was, 1950s maybe. He left the civil service and wrote a book satirizing the work in that place. And within that satire, he defined a number of laws, which are satirical, but really very, very true. And one of them is that work expands to fill the time available to it. This is true of all of us. If we have 2 hours to do a task, we spend 2 hours on the task. If we've got a deadline in half an hour, we'll complete it in half an hour. I took over an office of another organization, and the case managers had caseloads of 80 people, 80 job seekers. For various reasons, the contract changed. Their caseload shrunk to 35 job seekers they were working with at any one time. And they didn't know what to do. It's a great opportunity, I said. You can get more of these people into work. And they didn't, at least not to begin with, because the tasks they had expanded to fill the time available. They didn't see people more often. They saw people for maybe longer. They spent longer on their case notes. They spent longer in team meetings. They spent longer on process. Everything expanded to fill the time available, except what was important. Next slide, please. So performance for me of a case manager, and I've talked about a case manager on an employment program, but this is also true of so many other environments. I reviewed a failing social work service in which exactly the same was true. The performance of that case manager or that social worker is a product of their caseload, of course, but it's also a product of their productivity, if you like, how busy they are, the number of people and cases that they see each day, each week, and the quality of those interactions. Next slide, please. So I've just got one more example to take you through, and then I will we'll pause for comments, questions, and then I'll pass you over to social finance colleagues. But I just wanted to shift the view a little bit here. We talked about specific contracts. I talked about performance within an organization. The next organization that I went to set up sat within a big outsourcing company, and we wanted to try something different. Instead of delivering directly ourselves, we stood back from frontline delivery and subcontracted it to local organizations. The premise was, if we can subcontract to them and performance manage them rigorously, can we drive up that performance? And can we manage a journey for the job seekers between those different organizations based on the needs of the job seekers and the expertise of the organizations? So we'll sort of be an impartial, independent manager of the journey of the job seeker through that local provision. Can we get additional performance from that? We won 3 contracts in 3 regions of the UK. The total value of the contract was £750 million, and we had 75 subcontracted providers within our system. How on earth were we going to manage them and their performance? Next slide, please. And this is the delivery assurance framework that was implemented by a very clever group of people that I employed. I think now I would call that performance assurance framework. They wanted to call it delivery because they actually pulled apart quality and performance. I think they're the same thing. I think the numbers and the quality of the program are inextricably linked. I cannot help more people to achieve outcomes unless I really intervene with something that is of quality, unless I respect them, listen to them, and respond to them. That's the way that I achieve my numbers. Anyway, this was the system that they developed and implemented. And I think it pretty much captures everything. As I say, you will get a copy of this. In the top left, you've got the meetings and the reviews that were undertaken, from a weekly telephone call to monthly performance reviews to more formal quarterly board reviews. Down in the bottom, a description of the audits that would be undertaken, the verification, the checks that would be undertaken. First of all, checking the organizations, the subcontractors' own systems, and then going in to do spot checks as well. Then we've got these 2 defined systems, one looking at whether the provider themselves have got quality management within their organizations. Are they structured well? Are they recruiting people well? Are they managing them well? Are they listening to their customers, their job seekers? Do they have all of the policies and processes that they need in place? And are they effective? Are they realistic and impactful policies? And then we've got this framework of quality and performance management, where our quality and performance managers would go in and focus on these things. These are the KPIs that they're looking at. This is what would trigger a termination, the rules of the game, if you like, for the performance management. And then on the right, how that performance management was delivered. So if there was a problem with quality, the organization would have to produce a quality improvement plan. The provider would have to produce a performance improvement plan. We'd have risk ratings for all of these providers. And and the performance failures, the problems that they had, would be graded as small performance failures or big performance failures. And on the basis of those would be different step-ins from our team. They would step in and intervene in different ways to improve that performance, to try to improve that performance. And if they couldn't improve it, having tried everything, then we would terminate the contract, because our responsibility was to people accessing that program, the service users. That's our duty of care. Next slide, please. We won't pause on these. They're repeating really what's on that first slide. And again, you can refer to it later. But these are the standard reports that were produced and what went into those reports. Next one, please. A summary of the key performance indicators against which they were measured and against which their performance or underperformance was measured. And the next one, please. And then here's the minimum performance level, lower performance level. This is the big service failure and the lower service failure. On the next slide, please, Roxanne, I think that's set out. For me, and this was my perspective, I suppose, we've got a very complex tool here. It's really rigorous, it's robust, it's very systematic, it's very structured. This was a big contract, £750 million. But for me, the key tool was that on a weekly basis, every single one of the 75 subcontractors had to submit a report to me, copied to our data people, showing how many people they'd engaged on the program, new starts, how many people they had seen in the last week, how many jobs they'd achieved, and how many of those jobs had sustained. And that report from each of the service providers was compiled into one single report. And every Friday, at the end of the day, that went back out to every single one of the 75, and to our contract holders in the department, and to any stakeholders we had in local government in the areas where this was being delivered. Total transparency on a weekly basis of who was delivering what. And I would attach to it a small commentary saying, fantastic performance in Coventry today. You, service provider, have done a brilliant job. You've really changed your game. Last month, you really struggled, and look how many jobs you've achieved this month and how many lives you have changed. reinforcing the language of performance as life-changing interventions for people, moving as many long-term unemployed people as possible into jobs. And I think that's it, Roxanne. Next slide, please. That's it from me. We'll pause, I think, for questions and comments, Shamsia. So over to you.
Oh. Sorry, I could hear myself echo. That wasn't great. Richard, thank you for such a detailed, comprehensive overview of some of the overlying principles of effective performance management. There are no questions posted on the chat, but I wanted to give just pause and give a second for people on the floor, so to speak, to ask questions. So if you do have a question for Richard or a comment indeed, please feel free to just raise your hand and we can take those. Great. Jane, yeah, Jane, going over to you.
Hi, Richard. Thank you for that. I'm going to have another crack at the question I asked you earlier, because I thought you had a great answer. I put on the table, where does trust sit in this? And I think I put that question to you earlier very badly, because I think your reply to me was, it's sort of I won't paraphrase, but I think you sort of rejected the suggestion that trust, a lot of what we're doing here could be addressed by building trust into the processes. And I mean, I completely agree with you that trust is not a substitute for good performance management. But I'm just going to push back and say I do think it's part of it, though. And the reason I think it's part of it is that trust is when workers are, in my mind, sort of empowered frontline workers. So I think for me, the balance here is, how do you get that trust versus accountability right? I'd be really interested in your thoughts on that.
Thank you, Jane. I will attempt a different answer then to the question. And I think you're spot on. I made the point earlier about at Work Directions, how we tried everything to push autonomy down to the front line. One of the things we did was say to our frontline workers, you can spend some money to help these people find jobs if you want to. You can decide to buy things for them, to pay for some of their household bills, to do whatever it is that they need to get a job. And these people, when they started working for us, the case managers would always say, oh, great, how much can I spend? And we would say, we're not going to tell you. Because it's not £200, it's however much you need to spend for each individual you're working with.
Yeah.
Because you've got the control, the decision-making authority to do that. Now, we had to trust them to do that, but also, Jane, you know, I would monitor who was spending what. You know, I had to. I had to know how much we were spending in each of the offices, and if someone was spending too much, you know, we'd have to monitor what was going on. So you have to achieve the right balance. Absolutely, you've got to put trust down to the front line, because ultimately, I suppose you've got to trust your service user, haven't you? I hate this notion of us doing things to people. I have a problem even with us helping people. We're there to try and facilitate and empower people to achieve outcomes for themselves. And that means that we've got to trust them in their ability to do so. But I think what I was trying to say to you earlier was, I think this whole conversation around trust-based contracting actually has arisen because people are trying to shift away from bus ticket contract management, in which there are rigid service specifications of which contract managers are going to come and rigidly hold you accountable for, to the contracting body stepping back and going, okay, I want you to deliver these outcomes. I'm going to trust you to be flexible, to adapt, to innovate, to change. But at the same time, as the contracting body, and I've sat at every one of these positions in the system, as a contracting body, I'm still going to watch what they're doing very closely. I still want them to report to me on a monthly basis how they're performing and whether those innovations are working or not.
I did ask my question badly first time around. Thank you.
There's no such thing as a bad question, Jane. Richard, thank you, Jane. Richard, there's another question on the chat. So, is there a specific platform or system used to coordinate outcome tracking and impact evaluation you might want to expand on the difference between outcome tracking and impact.
So outcome tracking, I think, is very different to impact evaluation. Impact evaluation is very important. I need to understand whether I'm having an impact on rates of homelessness in the area where I'm delivering my service. But impact evaluation is not enough as a performance management tool. And it is often actually very divorced from service delivery, and often happens a year or two after the service delivery is ended, which is hopeless in terms of its ability to influence that performance. In terms of the outcome tracking, or let's talk about, Bhavana, the performance tracking, there's a number of different platforms that are out there. When I did this, so when I bought the system that was going to manage those 75 subcontractors, we spent £600,000 on that system. Oracle were trying to sell us one for £1 million. In the development impact bond in Palestine, we have a case management system that cost about £40,000. You don't have to overspend on this stuff. The price has come down considerably. There are lots of these systems out there, and different programs will tell you what they're using, but you do need some way to be tracking, capturing, and reporting it.
No, thank you so much for that question. Richard, one more from our Kimberly.
Our Kimberly asks if providers know their operating costs within their program within each level of care. In managed care performance contracting, when we set rates, we noticed there was something many providers did not know. It's a really good question, Kimberly, and it's extraordinary, isn't it? How many providers really don't appear to understand. Well, they don't understand the relationship between performance and cost, how much it is going to cost to pay for a case manager, and how many case managers they need for that size of a caseload, and what that number of case managers with that caseload mean in terms of the outcomes or the performance they can achieve. They don't have a model that shows them that. And when HPGI does this, we'll be helping and ensuring that every single service provider has an operating model that puts together those different parts of the equation. Even more extraordinary, though, is how many organizations really don't appear to understand what money they've got at all. And I think this is rather encouraged by grant-based funding, where I find organizations, they get money at the beginning of the year and they go, okay, we're a charity, we're a not-for-profit, so we do good things. And we're going to go off and do good things, and they do that until the money runs out. And then they go, oh, the money's run out. And they really had no link, again, I suppose. It's no operating model, no understanding of what the money is being paid for in terms of its delivery. I have to say, this also happens at the level of the contracting body or the government. I'll just quickly give you one example of this in the UK, which I think really illustrates the weakness in the system. And that was when David Cameron was Prime Minister. And he identified, as we all know, that there are a number of particularly troubled families in the UK. And these troubled families have a whole bunch of issues, a whole bunch of challenges, and they cost a lot of money. So in a community, there might be a small number of families who really drag in all of the resources and all of the cash, because they're the ones whose children are failing in school, who have particularly poor health, who might be involved in the justice system in some way. They're the troubled families. So he said, we've got to tackle these troubled families. I'm going to spend £100 million on troubled families in the UK. Fantastic. Then he said, and it wasn't him, it was his advisors and the people put in charge of this. Then they said, brilliant, there's 100,000 of these families. Now, 100 million is a lot of money. 100,000 is a lot of families. When you put the two together, you actually have £10,000 per family, which is not enough to shift their life trajectory. It's not enough to deliver the meaningful service that is actually going to address the trouble that family's got. Or is it £1,000 per family? Maybe 1,000. My maths is terrible. But the point being that in designing the policy and applying then the contract, they at a policy level, at a contracting level, didn't make this connection between what we spend and what we actually deliver.
It's a really good question, Kimberly, and thank you for posing it. Our next session, sort of session 3 on this, is looking at the operational consideration of designing an outcomes-based contract. So take it from a very service provider perspective. And one of the things we hope we will cover on that is kind of the difference between kind of your budget or your payments and the actual operating costs. And one of the things about an outcome-based contract is that you really do need to know about your operational costs and the costs of each, sort of the unit cost of the service that you're providing. Thank you.
We have one more hand, Shamsia. I don't know if you want to take a question or.
Yes, please, let's do.
Yes, so it's me. Thank you very much, Richard, for the presentation. Really inspiring. Actually, I have two questions. The first one would be how are the outcomes they are established? So in this process, how the operator are involved in terms of defining and agreeing to that, and what is the involvement of the population that are being targeted in those programs to setting these outcomes. And the second question is, how can we multiply the model? I mean, it's quite an interesting model, but for sure that to make it happen, there should be a lot of actions in terms of supporting public policy and also philanthropic or even social investment to make it happen. So how can we replicate the model for this case dissemination?
Thank you. I will attempt quick answers, if you don't mind, in the interest of time. How are the outcomes established? Really good question. It'll depend on the program and where the program is. And it will, yeah, I mean, it depends on who's making the decision. In some instances, the policymakers decide what the outcome should be, and then they go out and try and contract on that basis. In some instances, we see service providers delivering outcomes that they think are meaningful, coming forward and looking for a contract that will enable them to do it. I really like the question you ask about the involvement of the population, though, and I just want to give one example here. It's of a homelessness program in Greater Manchester, and there they have 5 outcomes. There are 2 outcomes which have been fixed in advance in agreement with the government. I don't know what they are, but for the sake of argument, it's accommodation and sustaining the accommodation for a period of time. And there's a payment attached to those 2. Then there are 3 more outcomes. And those outcomes are selected by the young homeless person themselves who is accessing the program. And I think there's a menu of potential outcomes that they can look at, a dozen or more of those, but they decide which ones are important to them and they rank them. Number 1, number 2, number 3. Number 1, the service provider gets paid more for, number 2, a little bit less, and number 3, less as well, less again. So the service user has selected them and ranked and prioritized them. I really like that model of putting that control in the hands of the individual. Multiplying the model. If you've got another 2 hours, we can talk about what we might need to do and what the blockers are to that. Sure, we need to build public commissioner capacity in understanding the link between cost and performance. We need to build their capacity in performance management, in contract design. We need to build the number of outcomes payers out there who are willing and able to pay at the end of the performance. There's no shortage of social investors willing to provide the working capital if it's needed. Shamsia, I will stop at that point.
Thank you.
I know time is running out. And
I had a question, Richard. So, sorry, I do have a question, Richard. I'm going to pose it now, but it would be great if perhaps you, Jane, Sarah, Chloe can take the question after Social Finance's presentation. And it's really about the difference. Richard, you mentioned the example in Hammersmith of the bus ticket and the contract manager coming in and wanting to audit the bus ticket. And it'd be really good if we could get a sense of what the difference is between a contract, sort of contractual management and performance management. But I'll pose that now, and then perhaps we can pick this up at the sort of session after Social Finance. So Jane, Sarah, Chloe, over to you. I think it's over to Jane first.
Thank you very much, Shamsia, and thank you, Richard. That's a really acute question that you've posed there, so I've made a note of it. So hello, everybody, and thank you, Richard, for that brilliant overview summary of performance management, both how and I think most importantly how it works in practice, because I think the practical dimension of performance management is key. So I'm from social finance. I'm a director at social finance. I'm with two colleagues today. They're the important ones because they're going to be taking you through two case studies. So Roxanne, if you could just move to the next slide. I'll just do a very brief introduction of social finance for those of you on the call who don't know us. So we are a non-profit. I am based in the UK, so is Sarah. Chloe is based in Nairobi at the moment. And we work across a whole range of social issue areas, with outcomes always at the center of what we're doing. Really trying to help the populations that we work with, the communities that we work with, and the organizations that we work with deliver lasting, sustainable change for the people and lives that they're seeking to support. So we can move to the next slide. So outcomes really are at the heart of our work. We're well known for the work that we do in outcomes-based finance, which is bringing financing mechanisms alongside a focus on outcomes in delivering programs. Now, this sort of schema of how you move from inputs to impact is something you'll all be familiar with, and a version of it was in Richard's deck earlier. But perhaps I can talk to our sort of perspective, our insight, if you like, for how we work in this space. And it's, in essence, it was that it's important to align funding to what works, not just to focus on outcomes, but also to align the relationships, the partnerships, and crucially, the funding towards outcomes. So traditional grant funding and also public sector funding focuses on inputs and activities, and it will produce or request retrospective end of grant reports or evaluations at the end of a program, which are sort of retrospective and static. And once you have those learnings, you can't actually operationalize those learnings unless you deliver a new program. So the question we asked ourselves is, why don't you learn as you go? Why don't you learn and adapt? And can you align the funding to enable you to do that? Because funding, the way programs were funded, prevented you from learning as you go. So that's really how we brought the ideas around financing outcomes-based programs with external finance to help particularly the public sector, but also private sector, to focus on outcomes and adapt along the way. So if we move to the next slide, we've worked, and Shamsia, Richard kindly referenced our work earlier. So we have been involved in the space for probably 15 years now, with the model of social impact bonds and development impact bonds. And the two examples that we're going to share with you, the case study is going to be using that financing model, but still with the same principles of performance management embedded within them. We've worked with a wide number of partners globally. I'm not going to go through this. Really, it's just to give a sense of the breadth of the world, really, perhaps a sense of optimism that there are people across the world who are looking to do things in different ways. And that's certainly what we found along the way. So turning to the next slide, which is the most important thing, is to introduce my two colleagues today who are going to talk about two case studies. Chloe is going to talk about outcomes-based contracts and the performance management of them in neonatal health. That's a program that she performance managed in Cameroon. And Sarah is going to talk about outcomes-based performance management in a mental health program. And that's a program that we took from a very small base in the UK and have progressively managed to replicate that and are taking it to scale. But before I sort of wrap up and just pass over to Chloe, maybe I could just say that performance management has a number of elements to it, but when we think of performance management in programs, we're really talking in our mind about a set of very simple and interconnected principles. The first is that your contract terms and your funding have the flexibility to enable you to move resources and funding about as you learn and understand what works or what needs to be overcome. The second is that you've got the data and you are collecting data and using that data to inform the decision-making about the spending of resources as you go. And the third is the governance structure, the partnerships that you build around it between those that fund and those that deliver, so that when you're looking at making decisions about how you adapt the program, that's a decision that has inputs not from just from the ultimate funder, but from the people who are going to be delivering on the ground. So hopefully those points are going to be picked up in Chloe and Sarah's presentations, and I will hand over to you, Chloe.
Brilliant, thanks, Jane, and thanks so much for having us. I'm really looking forward to today's session and hopefully to a good Q&A at the end. But I guess as by way of introduction, as Jane mentioned, I wanted to sort of present our role as performance management during the Kangaroo Mother Care Development Impact Bond, which was an impact bond that we helped design and also implement. And the implementation period was just over 2 years, so from February 2019 all the way through to September 2021. Maybe before we get into the detail of that, I can give you a bit more context on sort of the Cameroonian context, but also Kangaroo Mother Care, and then we'll talk a bit more about performance management and what that actually meant in practice, building on what's been said before. So if we could move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So I guess by way of background and context, Cameroon has a particularly high neonatal mortality rate. It's around 26.1 deaths per 1,000 live births, which is quite stark when compared to the OECD average of 4.1 deaths per 1,000 live births. And every year, 20,000 newborn babies die in Cameroon. So KMC itself is an evidence-based WHO recommended health practice for babies that are either born too early, so prematurely, or too small and low birth weight. It offers really great protection against newborn mortality, and recent studies have shown that it offers potentially greater protection than traditional incubator care, particularly in contexts where, in low-income contexts where a reliable source of power isn't always accessible. And these studies have also shown that it significantly reduces both infant mortality and morbidity. If we can move to the next slide, please. So what is KMC? It's founded around three main core components. The first is skin-to-skin care, which is demonstrated in the first image on the left. And that is to regulate the body temperature, the breathing, and the heart rate of the preterm or low birth weight baby. The second is there's a real focus around nutrition and promoting breastfeeding as the best form of nutrition, unless obviously it's medically counterindicated. And finally, one of the focus areas of KMC is that it enables earlier discharge, and due to the fact that it relies on the mother or father or carer's ability to continue delivering KMC at home, as opposed to traditional incubator care where a baby might stay in the NICU for potentially longer periods of time. If we move on to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about the overall structure. So I guess the DIB itself was, the main objective was to support public sector clinicians to use Kangaroo Mother Care for these premature and low birth weight babies. The practice at the time was well established in Colombia, but it was yet to be really scaled in Cameroon. I think at the time there was only one hospital that had quite a small KMC delivery unit or KMC unit. And so the idea was really to test whether or not this this practice could be scaled up in a different context, and therefore it made sense to have this quite flexible way of delivering a program, because we knew that there would be contextual adaptations that we'd have to make along the way, and there was relatively little data about sort of what may or may not work. The program supported over 10 hospitals, and the different players involved here were, so starting at the top, we had Grand Challenges Canada, who provided around $1 million Canadian in upfront risk investment. And then there was a combination of outcomes funders, so Nutrition International, the Ministry of Health of Cameroon, who used funding from the Global Financing Facility, and their combined contribution was around 2.4 million USD in outcomes funding. The service provider itself was a relatively small local NGO called the Kangaroo Foundation Cameroon, and they received technical advisory support from their Colombian counterparts to provide that sort of knowledge transfer from their context as well. And we also contracted an independent verification agent, and we'll talk a bit more about exactly what they did, but their role was to independently verify and assess outcomes reported by the foundation, so that the outcomes funders could then provide outcome funding. We also provided performance management advisory support, and as I said, I'll go into a bit more detail about exactly what that looked like. If we move on to the next slide, I'll talk about, so we mapped out, we had 3 main payment metrics, and the first payment metric was around the number of program hospitals that were that had trained clinicians and had the right infrastructure and facilities in place to deliver quality KMC. So there was an initial sort of ramp up phase where we needed to create KMC units within certain hospitals, make sure that they're the right sort of infrastructure and setup was there, and also train clinicians in this new way of delivering neonatal care. And that was independently verified using a sort of assessment grid, where the independent verification agent would go to the hospital and assess whether or not the hospital in question had all of the prerequisites. The second payment metric is around the number of babies receiving KMC, but not just the number of babies. We really wanted to try and capture the quality of KMC that was being delivered. And so in order to do that, we relied not just on data, but also on structured observations and interviews in order to really incentivize the delivery of quality KMC and make sure that that was being delivered in an appropriate way. And then finally, payment metric C was around the amount of the number of babies who came back during their follow-up appointment, which typically happens at around 40 weeks of gestational age, and assessed whether or not they were still receiving appropriate nutrition and if they'd gained enough weight. And the rationale for that was really to measure the impact post-discharge and the sort of longer-term impact of this practice. If we move on to the next slide. So as Jane was saying, kind of the way that we think about performance management is really 3 sides of this triangle. And we think that all 3 conditions need to be in place in order to be able to adapt program delivery to maximize outcomes. And so that's kind of having real-time performance data and driving insights from that data, being able to flexibly allocate budget based on what's coming out of that data, and also having the mandate and the governance structures in place that allow you to do so in a timely manner. If we move on to the next slide. In terms of the sort of work streams, and I think these differ across projects, but the overall shape of our work loosely falls into these 4 buckets. The first is around data management, so helping set up specific data tools, but also derive insights and identify opportunities for sort of what we could do better and how. We also supported with the sort of verification part. It was quite a complex verification structure that was needed because of that combination of in-person observations, data audits, etc. And so we played quite a big role in supporting the preparation of outcomes fund and overseeing that process. And again, I think in terms of the decision-making point of that triangle I was just talking about, we also kind of played an advisory role or an observer role on some of the key governance bodies, and supported the preparation of board packs, making sure that everybody had the right information at the right time. And then finally, the financial element, the financial management element of this, we developed a cash flow financial model that allowed us to measure performance in different hospitals and then flexibly allocate funding based on that. So in some instances, hospitals needed extra consumables or extra training, and we were able to sort of use that model to figure out where we could and couldn't support those requests, and what would make the most sense. And by make the most sense, I mean what would generate the most outcomes. If we move on to the next slide, please. I think that the shape of what we did really varied across throughout program delivery. So the initial phase of performance management is really about sort of setting up the right structures that will enable you to deliver in this way. And I think bearing in mind that the foundation at the time was quite a small and young foundation, we invested a lot of time up front in really embedding and developing those systems. Then kind of once we moved into delivery, we got to a bit more of a steady state, and there's the sort of performance management becomes a bit more of a cyclical practice where you prepare for a verification, the verification delivers sort of insights or evidence on what's happening, and then you kind of take stock and look at what changes need to be made, and the cycle kind of continues. Then obviously COVID-19 happened, and that was a really interesting test in terms of exactly how flexible are these programs, and how can we adapt in the face of unforeseen circumstances. And so I'm really proud personally of the fact that we were able to continue service delivery throughout the pandemic. We did make some changes to the contracts and to the way in which verifications took place, but that was quite a big part of our role at the time, was thinking about different scenarios and making sure that the governance structures were able to make the right decisions. And then I think finally in the sustainability, or sort of on the close down of the DIB, which as I mentioned ended a few years ago now actually, we supported the foundation with thinking about lessons learned and sustainability planning. So I guess as you can see, it's hard to define specific work streams. They vary across time, but hopefully this gives you a bit of a flavor as to what performance management meant for us in this specific project. If we move on to the next slide, I wanted to give you a more concrete example of exactly how this approach was used to inform program delivery. So in the spirit of sort of innovation and adaptation that both Jane and Richard mentioned as being quite a key component of a lot of these impact bond or outcomes-based approaches, there was a specific pot of money that was set aside at the beginning of the program for a community engagement strategy, or to support community engagement. And rather than define exactly how that money should be used at the beginning of the program, the thinking was after a few months of service delivery, we'd kind of take stock, look at the data, and then develop the community engagement strategy based on what was really happening and what the program needs were, rather than kind of upfront before we had much understanding of exactly what the Cameroonian context was like. And so to do that, we kind of did a data deep dive, as we called it, and looked at the distance that the patients travelled to each of the hospitals that were in operation at the time. And based on that, we then developed a community engagement strategy that enabled mothers to attend their follow-up appointment in a clinic nearer to home, so reducing the overall amount of time that they spent travelling. And bearing in mind that this was obviously one of the 3 payment metrics that I mentioned earlier, I think it was great that we then saw significant increases in the follow-up rates, which I think is a testament to this type of approaches and to the community engagement plan that was then set in place. I think just moving on to the next slide then. I wanted to share some quotes from somebody other than me, waxing lyrical about performance management. But I think what really comes out in this first quote here, which is from the CEO of the foundation, was how they were able to test innovations and make alterations as they went. And I think, you know, they'd received some more sort of grant-based or input-based funding before, and I think the biggest difference for the service provider was really this ability to make quick decisions and change how they were doing things without necessarily having to go back to the funder and explain why that was the case, and that incurs delays. And I think particularly actually in COVID, it was the timeliness of that was really important, and enabled us to move really quickly. I've got 2 more slides, so just on the next slide, please. When we talk about I wanted to talk a little bit about the overall achievements of the DIB. So we 1,221 babies received quality KMC, and that was about 28% above the initial DIB target. So that was a really great result, and we saw similar results at the point in terms of exclusive breastfeeding and appropriate weight gain. What that meant in the terms of funding was that the full 2.4 million of outcomes funding was paid out, and then there was also full repayment of outcomes-based investment, including a risk premium back to the social investor Grand Challenges Canada. I'll just share on the final slide some key lessons learned. And I'll actually share in the chat a link to a kind of longer, much more detailed report that we did on this at the end of the programme, in case that's of interest. But in terms of lessons learned, I think the first is the importance of these rapid feedback loops. So what I mentioned earlier in terms of collecting ongoing quantitative data, having in-person verifications to really look at the qualitative data, and then adapting the program based on that, and then sort of going again. The second was actually around the value of having cross-sector governance. So on the various governance bodies, we had representatives from government, from the private sector, but also from leading clinicians and academics. And that really allowed us to draw down on lots of different types of expertise to be able to make the sort of programmatic decisions that we ended up making. This third point is around making sure that the delivery staff, so in this case clinicians and pediatricians, also had an adaptive mindset, and that they had the right information that they needed to be able to adapt how they delivered KMC. And then I think the fourth one, I think, is it kind of comes back actually to Jane's initial presentation about why we want to put outcomes at the heart of international development and in other contexts as well, is that it creates this really clear focus on priorities, and everybody had a pre-defined and pre-agreed definition of success, and I think that made making programmatic decisions that bit easier. And then finally, I think there's this point around kind of needing clear responsibilities to be able to make these decisions, and that's the importance of that third point of the triangle. And it's not just enough to have flexible budgets and data, but you also need to be able to make the decisions that you need to make in a timely manner. I'll stop there. I think I'm handing over to Sarah, but I'm really looking forward to some questions at the end. Thanks.
Thanks, Chloe. Great to hear a bit more detail about kangaroo mother care. So if you could click through the slides, please. So yes, as mentioned, I'm Sarah Bailey, a manager at Social Finance, and I'm sort of the overseer of our employment-based contract for mental health. So we at Social Finance started this impact bond in relation to mental health services into 2015, and the social impact bond is still going today, and it is designed around delivering employment support services for people with mental illness called individual placement and support. So if I can have the next slide, I'll just give a bit of background about what we mean by that. So what is the challenge that we were trying to solve? So our statistic on the left there gives you a bit of context, which I imagine a lot of you have been engaged with previously, which is that a small proportion of people with mental illness are in work, but the large majority of them want to work and want to gain the benefits of a sense of purpose and a sense of place that comes from having meaningful employment that also supports their recovery. So what's the solution? So as I mentioned, this is a service called IPS. It's evidence-based. There's a lot of research in really rigorous evaluation settings that show it can have twice the rate of job outcomes that traditional employment support services can have for people with mental illness. And it's sort of a place and train model, it's called. So if you go to the next slide, I can give a bit more detail about what that means. So IPS is a service that integrates an employment support worker into a secondary mental health care service, so supporting people with complex needs. These are the 8 key principles of the IPS service. I'm not going to go into all the details, but the main important elements of the service is that it's for anyone who wants to work. It's not about those who are work ready or needing support. It tries to place people into competitive work quickly, so not sheltered work or volunteering, and we find roles for people in the area that they're interested in, that they have skills in, where they've worked previously, not just where we've got a connection with the employer. So we focus on placing people into these roles as quickly as we can and supporting them ongoing during their time in that role. So the employment support worker is called an ES, an employment specialist, and that employment specialist will interact with their mental health care providers and with their employer to make sure that they've got the correct support in place over a long term in that role. So if I could have the next slide, please. So what is the context of social finance here? So social finance set up a separate legal entity known as the Mental Health and Employment Partnerships, we call MHEP, to run this impact bond. So what were the key goals of that? So we did this to be able to pull together national and local funding to deliver this IPS service across the UK, mostly focused in London, but services outside. As I described, IPS is an evidence-based service, but a lot of that evidence is overseas. And part of what we wanted to show was the value of IPS in the UK setting, to build evidence and a base of knowledge about the outcomes that we can achieve for people in this service. We also wanted to test IPS in new settings, so it was designed for people with mental illness, but some of the sites that we've tested as part of our MHEP program have been delivering it to people experiencing addiction and for people with learning disabilities. So MHEP, as this impact bond, because of its focus on outcomes, we're able to learn quickly about IPS in the UK to begin with. And as we learnt that, we then expanded into IPS for new cohorts to really build up that evidence base to see how we can take that to discussions nationally about expanding the service, which we've been able to achieve. IPS is now the key service being delivered for people with mental illness to get into work across the UK, and services have also been expanded for people with addictions off the back of some of the evidence that started out of MHEP. So if you go to the next slide, I won't go into too much detail about this diagram, but similar to Chloe's, essentially we are, MHEP is the sort of central cog in this wheel of other organisations whereby we raise capital from investors, Big Issue Invest, which we then use to support the delivery of IPS services in local settings. So our providers are there at the bottom, and we as MHEP work alongside a local commissioner of these services. So this is the normal organisations that would commission these services. We've come in to co-commission services and draw down some central outcomes fundings as well. So we raise the capital from the investor, use that to provide this funding for the services. Importantly, the vast majority of those of that funding for the providers is actually payment by block and not by outcome. But we receive outcomes funding from our local and our central commissioners that we use as MHEP to encourage better performance out of our providers. So we're sort of the central performance management cog in this whole piece. So if you can click through to the next slide. So what have we achieved? Just to go through these headlines early on. Nearly 6,000 people have been engaged with our services. Just under 2,000 have found meaningful work. And of those, 65% of people have sustained that work for 13 weeks or more. So this snapshot as well gives you an indication of how we think about the outcomes that we're achieving. So if you go on to the next slide, I can go into a bit more detail about that. So what did we measure as success in this particular impact bond? We think of this as the funnel that people move through our services. So a person is referred in from the mental health service, and our first outcome metric is engagement. So when we officially begin working with a person, the employment specialist helps them write an employment plan for their goals to achieve in work. And that's how we measure our engagement. If that person then begins work, we then can measure the outcome of a job start, which is our key success metric. We also, as Chloe mentioned, we also independently verify these outcomes. And so, for example, for the job start, our verification organization checks for payslips and employment contracts. And then as a person then moves to sustain that job, we measure if they're still in that job in 13 weeks after they began work. This sustainment metric is an important one for us to get an indication of the longevity of impact that we're able to have for the people that we work with. We also measure whether it's part-time or full-time. So our independent verifier works with us to verify each of these to then make our claims for outcomes payments that come into MHEP. If you can move on to the next slide, please. So I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about what we mean by performance management in this particular mental health context. And up on the slide, I've got the sort of key inputs that I think have made our performance management relationship successful. Firstly is the timely data. As Chloe mentioned, as Richard mentioned, we regularly, in real time, and then independently verify the data that we collect. We then use that to create visualizations. So we've got charts, figures, RAG ratings. I'll show you what those look like in a few slides' time, to be able to have a conversation around the outcomes that are being achieved in the moment. A key element of our success in performance management we see is the collaborative relationships that we can build with the providers that are delivering the service. We've been working with some of them for quite a long time, and I think the culture that we've been able to create around collaborating and jointly problem solving together has enabled us to use the performance management relationship as a one that learns quickly and adapts quickly to changes that occur in the services. And similar to what Chloe described, we were able to really put this model to work during the COVID-19 pandemic. Being a health crisis and an employment crisis, it was a real challenge for us to deliver the service through COVID-19. And I think our role as a performance manager and the strong relationships we had with commissioners enabled us to work quickly on behalf of providers and change contracts and change outcome metrics as we needed to be able to continue to deliver in those tough conditions. So the relationships were really important. The other key element we found that's successful to our performance management in this case is that on our team, we have an IPS service expert. His name is Gary, and he's an absolute genius when it comes to IPS. He's been delivering and supporting these services for decades. And being able to have his insight on our team has really helped us build rapport with the providers that they know we understand the details of how their services work, and that we can really get under the hood and help them with their specific problems when we need to address them. So if you go on to the next slide, I'll just quickly talk through some of the key elements of what this performance management feels like in person. We're meeting regularly on a quarterly basis with commissioners and with providers, and we are bringing the data that they provide us to the front of our discussions with them. Because we work with multiple providers, we're able to bring our insights from other settings to when we have discussions with our particular service providers, which I think helps kind of show the context that we understand that they're working in, and other ideas about how they can improve their services, which has been really helpful. And the service providers come and present their own ideas about how they think they can improve their services or where they want to focus on lifting engagement and job starts for their people. So what does this feel like? So often coming out of the end of our performance management discussions, we might have an action for the commissioner to work more closely with their own organisations to unblock bottlenecks around engagement with mental health teams, or we might organise Gary to come and visit them on site and work specifically with the team leader on kind of how they manage their team better. The providers we might have been able to identify that one area is struggling more than the other, and they can move resources around. So we're able to get to really practical solutions in a really quick turnaround based on the data that we've collected. If you could just go on to the next slide, which just shows you some dashboards about what they look like. And to the question that was asked earlier around what tools we can use to collect this information. We have lots of different service providers that use lots of different tools to manage their own services and their own customers. And we just collect a very simple Excel spreadsheet. So our providers have been able to organize an extract for us that just is spat out of their systems each month, and then we collect those in Excel. It's quite simplistic, really, and didn't require lots of expense to generate. If you could go to the next slide. Again, like Chloe mentioned, we've been evaluated by an external party at the moment called the Go Lab at Oxford University, and I'll post in the chat the link to some of their findings about how MHEP has gone specifically, particularly in an outcomes-based contracting setting. But some of the things that they found were these quotes on the screen, that the Commissioner really appreciates the extra intelligence that we can bring and the data that they wouldn't have otherwise had, and the providers really like being able to brainstorm and work on things with us. If you could just go on to the next slide, which is I think my final one, also around the lessons learned. So some of these Chloe has covered already, but just wanted to go through a few of the quick things that we've found that have worked really well around performance management on MHEP, which is, as I mentioned, having strong relationships. It means that we can have early conversations with the providers that we work with when we're sensing trends around performance. As Jane mentioned earlier, it is about trust, and we have to balance these relationships quite finely around working collegially, brainstorming together, but also when we need to, using a bit more of the formal performance management and contract management tools that we have at our disposal to support providers when they are underperforming. And I think it comes a little bit to your question from earlier, Shamasa, which is that sometimes we have to rely on the contract and the contract management when situations are getting more dire and performance is worsening. We have a board and an investor to answer to, balancing that with the outcomes management that we're wanting to do on the short-term basis. It does become a bit of a balancing act to be able to toe that line between working as their friend and being that sort of performance manager in a formal sense when we need to. And one other lesson I'll bring out quickly is, I think an important thing for us to build relationships and performance manage is acknowledging what the data doesn't show. When you pick outcomes metrics, you can really focus in on specific elements of a service, and it might not always cover all of the nuance. And I think for us to be able to explain to our providers that we understand the things that aren't shown by a job start and a sustainment at 13 weeks, it might not show how a person's moved from part-time into full-time work and all those sorts of things. I think early acknowledgement of the fact that we understand what isn't shown has really helped us build more collegial relationship and to be able to focus on the impacts that we can have, which I think is important rather than getting into kind of negative conversations about how we don't understand their services. Those are some of the things I wanted to cover. Thank you for your time today, and I will kind of open it up if anyone has any questions for myself or Chloe or Jane. I touched on a little bit of your question earlier, but if anyone else wants to follow up on that, that'd be great.
Sarah, Chloe, thank you so much. Really insightful. And what was also really interesting with your two examples and some of the examples that Richard shared is how different the programs are, and how some of the principles of performance management and effective management kind of continues, but actually you also have to make it bespoke to that program, which I think is an added advantage. So let's see if there are any further questions or comments. There are none on the chat, but I'll give everyone a second or two to to raise their hands if they do have any. That's just Sarah. Great. Okay. So no questions at the moment. I wonder, Jane, Richard, if you wanted to come in and chime into Sarah's response to the question I posed earlier.
I'll have a first crack, if I may. I thought actually Sarah put her finger on it. Because I think that contract management, they could be done by separate parties, but they could also be done as a continuum. And I suppose the contract management end is the sort of the black and white sharp sort of harder instrument end, whereas the performance management end is much more about troubleshooting and discovering and finding solutions. I think, in my mind, I was thinking as we were speaking, it's almost that if you're contract managing, it's as if you're sitting across a square table from people. You're on the other side. They have a position and you have. Performance management, in my mind, is that you're sitting around a round table, and because you're solving problems together and looking for solutions, and you're focusing on the outcomes, you have a budget envelope that you need to work to. So that's all I was going to add to that. But I think Sarah put her finger on it.
Right. I love the analogy of the round table and the square table. Actually,
inspired by our logo.
Inspired by the logo. Actually, one of the interesting, Richard mentioned the organisation that he set up pretty much from scratch back in 2002, and that's where Richard and I first met. Interestingly, there was a decision taken to not have a square table where you were sitting opposite the job seeker, but actually we sat side by side and kind of supported them into work together, which was kind of part of the culture that Richard talked about in terms of creating a performance culture and a supportive one. Richard, thank you, Jane. Richard, I wondered if you wanted to add anything to that or not.
I think I talked quite a lot about that, Shamsi, already, really. They probably shouldn't be different things. But one of the reasons that we talk about them as different, and one of the reasons that we emphasize performance management, is that we see too often contract management, implemented as a very process-oriented thing. Partly because the contracts, I think, themselves are very badly framed and very badly written and disappear into legalese, and lose sight of what the ultimate objective of that contract is. So we shift to performance management to enable us to have a conversation about that objective, about ultimately the purpose of it. And if we're going to talk about why we're here, what it is that we're looking to deliver in terms of outcomes, then we have to have a round table like Jane suggests. I love that analogy too.
Great, thank you all. Just a comment from Kimberly on the chat. It's a really cool, matches data on patient preferred outcomes research regarding employment being a chief goal. And I think this is aimed at social finance. Have you presented this data at conferences designed for prescribers, for example, or provider conferences as a whole? Kimberly, is that fair?
Is that one for me, I think? Yeah, around kind of, employment data. The short answer is no. I don't believe we've presented some of this information at prescribing specific conferences. In terms of the way that we speak with providers of IPS services, one of the arms of social finance that has sort of spun out of MHEP actually is a support service we call IPS Grow, which is a service that supports IPS providers across the UK. As it was rolled out across the UK at quite a quick fashion, we saw the need to kind of better engage with providers to help them deliver IPS to the best quality that they can, around the fidelity of them delivering the service compared to how it's designed and how it should work in relation to the 8 principles that I put up earlier. So we sort of engage closely with providers through that sort of IPS Grow arm, and a lot of the learnings that came out of the first years of MHEP led into the development of that, and it's now full of really excellent IPS specialists that kind of build on some of those principles around better understanding the outcomes and the sort of performance data that is being collected alongside service delivery. So IPS Grow is an interesting place to have a look to see some of that information.
Great. Sarah, thank you. There are no further questions and I can't see any hands raised. And so given the time, we will wrap it up now. Thank you to everyone who's taken time out of busy schedules and days to join us. We hope you found this session as insightful and useful as we have. And some of us have been involved in performance management, outcomes-based contracting for a while. We learn something new each time one of these sessions are held. So thank you. And a particularly special thanks to the speakers, to Richard, and especially to our social finance colleagues for joining us in this. It's been really useful and really great to have you on board. So thank you. As I said earlier, we'll make all of this available publicly and we'll let you know as soon as it's on our website. But otherwise, I hope to see as many of you as possible again post-summer for our third session on kind of the operational consideration of working on outcomes-based contract. So thank you all. Thanks, Roxanne, for driving all of this. See everyone soon.
Thank you.
Bye.